What happens when you take Godzilla, an alien spaceship, a desire to take over the world, and throw that all into a blender? Orga. Orga's what you get. Despite only being in a single movie, Godzilla 2000, and being a relatively new addition to Godzilla's roster of kaiju enemies, he's remained a very popular kaiju in the consciousness of the community, as well as actually being the first kaiju I ever saw Godzilla fight. So while he is far from my favorite, he is personally very special to me. A relatively unique kaiju amongst the Godzilla series and kaiju as a whole, as he is both an alien species that are all kaiju, and yet Orga is not his natural form. Before we get on to the rest of the video, I just want to thank you guys for getting us to 1K. I never imagined we'd get this far this fast. Thank you guys. Let's hope for another 1K. The Millennian genetic abomination, Orga. Earth's would-be conqueror and Godzilla's imperfect clone. He is also far from a simple creature, as much like a Destroya, which that video got taken down, each of his forms are radically different and have their own abilities and will really be requiring their own explanations. As mentioned before, the species of what Orga is actually called a Millennian. Orga is simply their mutant form. The first we see of them, because we never actually see what they naturally look like more or less until the end of the movie, is their rock-encrusted spaceship. Kaiju and geology, two of my favorite things together. The ship is not actually made of rock, it's just simply covered in it after it quite literally crash-landed into the ocean during the Cretaceous period. There's no pilots inside the ship in any form we'd recognize. The Millennians proper simply reduced themselves into an antimatter quantum fluid blob in order to survive the harsh trek through space for all those many, many years. And the ship was now simply an extension of them and their psychic will. In order to restore themselves to their full original proper form and to better adapt to Earth's conditions, they were looking for a suitable genetic donor to parasitize to become this form. After glossing over humanity, not deeming them fit enough to be their genetic host, they look to Godzilla and find him to be their ideal genetic template. The reason it took so long for them to wake up, despite crashing in the Cretaceous period, because their ship is solar powered, and the light from the submarine shining on it gave it just enough power to reactivate. Yeah, again, these movies are freaking weird and I love them. They didn't actually come after Godzilla for his atomic powers. Rather, they went after for a specific part of his cells, his regenerative capabilities. Owed to something known as the Organizer G1, or if you are familiar with the dub like I am, the Regenerator G1, which I actually find is a much better and more fitting name for what this ability does. This component of Godzilla's cells is what allows him to heal both at such a rapid rate and with no scar tissue forming within a matter of hours. And this is not just for pieces of Godzilla's flesh that are attached to his body. This is applicable to chunks of flesh that are blasted off of him. Keep in mind, if they're not attached to his body, the healing would likely be even slower, and there was no scar tissue on the chunk of flesh that had been blasted off hours after, meaning the body was likely fully restored in a much shorter time span. While Godzilla has had a very high level of regenerative capabilities in almost every iteration he has existed in, Godzilla 2000 is the only incarnation to actually explain how this really happens. It shows that the Regenerator G1 is something that exists within his cells. It's not exactly clear if this is some sort of a protein, an enzyme, or a special organelle that performs this regenerative capabilities to allow the cells to heal, but is not just some simple random thing that just happens with no reason. And the Millennians wish to absorb this from Godzilla, and to do that, they gotta subdue the King of the Monsters, which is something that the Millennian spaceship is actually capable of doing. With its internal laser cannon, it was actually able to knock the King of the Monsters around, blasting him into several large buildings, and even a second blast sent Godzilla retreating to the bottom of the sea. However, over the course of this battle, Godzilla's atomic breath strikes did destroy much of the rocky exo covering, revealing its true alien nature. Further capabilities of this Millennian UFO are the Millennians are capable of psychically hacking into technology. Using tentacles only visible through infrared sensing, they're able to infiltrate all of Tokyo's computer systems and absorb data from the internet, as well as broadcast their message of conquest to the globe. This shows that they are actually very intelligent, capable of understanding and translating human forms of speech and text into their own language. However, these plans for global conquest are immediately put on hold as Godzilla returns, coming out for revenge this time. And despite the weapon systems of the ship being quite formidable, as now we see they are capable of telekinetically controlling cabling underneath Tokyo's streets to ensnare Godzilla, drag him around, and even anchor him in place. After toppling a building onto Godzilla, they begin to use their psychic tentacles in order to steal some of Godzilla's DNA, namely for that Regenerator G1. Merging this with their antimatter quantum fluid form underneath the ship, we now get to see the Regenerator G1 restore the Millennians to their full and proper form. We'll be getting into them next. While the Millennium UFO does possess very impressive offensive capabilities, defensively it is very underwhelming. After Godzilla escaped from the rubble under which he had been trapped, a single atomic blast completely cut the ship in half, showing that without its rocky exterior to absorb an impact, it can't really take a punch even though it can throw him out. As for the Millennium's full true form, we don't really get to see all that much of it beyond the fact that they have very long, spindly, tentacle-like arms and legs, and they're capable of bioluminescence, their head changing colors and lighting up in response to different emotions and different sounds that they make, indicating some form of display. It is also not entirely clear if this Millennium is simply a supersized version of their natural form, as all the Millenniums have been implied to merge into a singular entity, and this is just a scaled up version of them, or something else. But quickly after assuming this form, the sheer volatility of Godzilla's DNA takes over, and it begins to violently mutate, as a result of the aggressive healing capabilities of the Organizer G1 overwhelming their body. Stumbling and falling into a giant cancerous blob that would eventually become Orga, it is still clear that this thing does have psychic capabilities, as it is capable of communicating with the remains of the UFO. But now it assumes its somewhat stabilized form in Orga. I always thought the name was really just short for something like organism, but no, it's actually short for Organizer G1, or at least derived from Organizer G1, which, again, I never picked up on because I always saw the American dub of it, where it was called Regenerator G1. In this new form, it's almost an amalgamation of a deformed, mutated version of its natural Millennium form, Godzilla, and the UFO form, complete with an organic cannon in the exact same position. The beam fired from this is known as the Destructive Motion Attack, or Wave Motion Beam. In terms of physical capabilities, not all that much is actually shown of what Orga's capabilities are, beyond the fact that he is incredibly fast and agile for a creature of his inordinate bulk, jumping very acrobatically for extremely long distances and very high heights, with exceptional ease, though this could be somewhat related to his psychic capabilities, as he is shown to be able to communicate and still control the remains of the Millennium UFO, still piloting around and using it actually as a shield. So whether this is true full brute physical strength and agility, or some sort of psychic ability adding onto it, is not exactly clear. As mentioned before, it is capable of deploying the remains of the Millennium UFO to block Godzilla's atomic ray. In the process, this does destroy the remains of the ship, but most of Orga's attacks are about positioning himself to use the destructive motion beam attack rather than a direct physical combat, as it only lands a single hit on Godzilla throughout their entire battle, in terms of a physical strike. With its Godzilla-derived mutation, this also grants it an extremely potent healing capability, something that actually seems to exceed Godzilla's recovery speed, as one atomic blast completely destroyed Orga's shoulder, including the shoulder cannon, and it regenerated almost immediately. However, it is worth noting that the cannon did not reappear on Orga's shoulder. This means that despite the speed of this recovery, it is very much an imperfect system, and as such, this weapon was no longer available for Orga to use for the remainder of its life. It also no longer has the psychic tentacles that the Millenniums had before. Instead, when it came to absorbing Godzilla's DNA, it needed to land a physical strike on him, either biting or using its flowering mouth and opening its jaws extra wide, as the mouth we see is actually really not even half of Orga's true mouth. splitting its jaws all the way back and opening this giant flowering throat, trying to pull Godzilla in. It is able to absorb significantly more of Godzilla's DNA, allowing it to sprout the large dorsal spines characteristic of Godzilla, and its lumpy flesh turning green and resembling Godzilla's scales. But this brings us to Orga's weaknesses. He is not exactly the brightest tool in the closet, if you get what I mean. The sheer scale of his grotesque mutations have removed some, if not most, of the advanced Millennium intellect it once possessed. Again, only allowing it to land a single punch on Godzilla throughout the entire fight, and primarily focused on just avoiding Godzilla's attacks. Though the use of his shoulder cannon blaster as a means of ranged offense does show it does have some intelligence and battling capabilities, though this was likely only as an instinctive method of subduing Godzilla for its ultimate goal of assimilating Godzilla's DNA, as that is the only thing it cares about in this entire fight. This single-minded desire to assimilate Godzilla's DNA is ultimately what would doom it. However, throughout the fight it did seem to somewhat degenerate intelligence, as at the beginning it initially tried communicating with Godzilla seemingly. Another weakness, as mentioned, is with the assimilation of Godzilla's DNA, it was capable of healing at an extremely rapid rate, but this healing was very much imperfect. Meaning any damage Orga sustained, and later immediately healed, could potentially cripple it if certain parts of his body were targeted, leading to overall weaker offensive capabilities, as shown with it being unable to use its motion wave cannon. After fully opening its flowering mouth to swallow Godzilla whole and fully assimilate his DNA, this exposed the central core of the creature to Godzilla using a nuclear pulse to incinerate the upper portion of its body. Again, driven by its single-minded desire of assimilation, it exposed an enormous weak point. This led to the complete vaporization and obliteration of not only Orga's head, but most of his upper body. Meaning, even if somehow Orga had survived, what little remained of its governing intelligence would have been lost, leading to a brain-dead mass of flesh. Ultimately, he is a very interesting kaiju. Very weird, and even a standout amongst many of the other antagonists in the Godzilla series. Unlike Ghidorah, he is not a simple puppet. Unlike many other giant mutation creatures, he is not an omnicidal destroyer of all things like a Desitroya is. And he is not straight up crazy like Scar King. All of this, combined with his abilities and the general appearance of the creature, especially those oversized gorilla hands and knuckle walking, make him a very unique and standout kaiju amongst a sea of fantastic creatures. He was not the first clone of Godzilla, and he certainly will not be the last. Heck, there was even a later one that came out after this. So what really is what makes him stand out? It's gotta be the fact he just straight up tried to eat Godzilla. But what do you think of Orga? Love him? Hate him? Want to see him in the Monsterverse? And what was your first Godzilla movie? And what was the first Godzilla antagonist you ever saw? And don't forget to leave a like, and while you're down there, subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. I've been Max Allo, and long live the Kaiju King.